How bad is power creep in every card game? We've actually watched a video of this YouTuber before and it was quite interesting, so I'm down. Oh yeah, that was the one. How good is it to draw 2 cards in every card game, right? Yeah, that was interesting.
This is my video on how bad power creep is in every card game. So power creep. The idea of power creep is when you take a card and then you're going to print a newer version of that card that is strictly better than the previous version. Sorta. It's also when you have a card that is powerful and sees play in a metagame, and then you're going to replace that with a newer version of a card that isn't exactly the same, but serves a similar purpose, therefore kicking out the previous card. Once again, sort of. Power creep.
Isn't power creep just the general idea of the power level of the game going up? At least that's how I interpret it.
It can also be when you have a deck that comes out that is more powerful than previous decks, therefore pushing those previous decks that used to be strong out of the metagame. All of these kind of revolve around the same idea, which is a new card coming out that's going to push out an old either card or strategy that used to be viable and that will no longer be playable thanks to the new card. That's what power creep is. But in general, there's some important things that you need to know about power creep. And one is that power creep is required for games for them to keep up their player base. If you don't print new cards that people are going to want to get, that means you're not going to have enough people playing in your game and getting into your game from new perspectives. So power creep is important to keep your game fluid and continuing to print.
I've thought about this a lot because power creep is a very prominent topic. I don't know if this is 100% true in terms of, like, they are saying power creep is necessary to keep the game running. In some ways that's true. In other ways, there's a lot of games out there that have people super interested and invested and new people join without ever changing the game, right? Thinking chess or poker or any of that nature, right? Those games never change fundamentally, but people still get interested in them and so on and so forth. The reason why trading card games need power creep is for it to be more profitable for the company, of course, right? Like, because the reason why they want us to buy new cards is because, like, the game needs to be profitable, right? Like, chess or poker is not really a game that's being sold anymore. Of course, people, like, there's companies making chessboards or something like that, but there's no one company behind chess that is living off of selling chess pieces and innovating on chess. You know what I mean, right? Like, it's an interesting topic where power creep is necessary for games that are, like, ongoing and ever changing because they're trying to sell new cards, which is understandable. That's not necessarily a bad thing either. Like, the game changing and evolving is cool in some ways. I think power creep is just mainly, there is something exciting about new cards coming out and replacing old cards, and there's also something sad about it, right? Like, when you know, people, every once in a while you get really excited for a new archetype and you want to play that new archetype, and then every once in a while you realize, hey, that archetype I once really liked is now not playable anymore, and that can be sad, right? So it's a whole lot of mixed feelings when it comes to power creep.
Sets over and over again, power creep is just required. It also must be handled with a lot of care, because if you have too much power creep inputted into your game can drastically warp and change to a way that you wouldn't want it to be. Power creep is a lot of fun though, which is why we see it a lot. If you're playing a deck with a card that you love a lot, and then you have a new card from the new set that comes out that is also powerful and slots right into the deck that you were already playing, you're going to have a great time. However, power creep is also dangerous, because in the same idea, let's say you have a card that you love playing in your deck that you've been playing for a long time, and then a new card comes out that completely encapsulates what your card does, but is simply better. Therefore, you no longer get to play with that old card that you used to like to play with a lot, because you'll be forced to play the new card in the better version in your deck, or you simply will be at a disadvantage for playing the older version of the card, being a very dangerous effect. One more thing though, power creep is very lucrative, which is another reason you're going to see it in a lot of card games. You have a card here that is going to be seen play a lot in lots of different formats, and it's going to be powerful, and then you're going to replace that with a better card. That card is newer, and therefore you have to buy.
One theory that I also have about power creep, and why I think power creep is also happening in games like games that have rotation, basically, right? We're going to talk about that I'm assuming they're going to talk about that in this video, like power creep in Pokemon, power creep in Magic. Games that have rotation still experience power creep. And why is that? Because you would say, oh, they have no need to print more powerful cards because the cards rotate. Well, if you want to make people buy new cards that you make, you gotta make those cards exciting. And I think cards can be exciting in two ways. They can either do something more powerful than previous cards, or they can do something fundamentally different, right? Like a card could be could have a completely different effect that is not really more powerful or less powerful than another effect, but it's just a completely different thing, right? Like when you make a new Yu-Gi-Oh deck, that it just has a completely different concept. It just works on a completely different axis than other Yu-Gi-Oh decks. It's not necessarily more powerful or less powerful by design. It just feels different, right? So like you can go on one of two axes. You can either make a deck that does the same thing as other decks but more powerful, or it just does something completely different. So it basically is and you have an x-axis and a y-axis where it goes like the power level, and then like basically the creativity of the new cards, whatever you want to call it, right? And I personally think the reason why those other card games still experience power creep in terms of just more powerful cards is that there's just a limited design space, and it's hard for designers to always make new cards that aren't inherently more powerful and just work differently, right? For example, if I tell you make a new card that people want to buy instead of Pot of Greed, all right? What's the easier solution? Is it easier to just make a card that says draw 3 cards? Because that is easily better than Pot of Greed. Or is it easier to design a different spell card that is just fundamentally different from Pot of Greed, but still at about the same power level, right? And of course, the second one is possible. Right? It's possible to make a spell card that has maybe a similar role but is functionally different, but it's harder to make that than just straight up making a better card. And that's why I think even those other games experience power creep, because there's just limited design space if you always only trying to go sideways in terms of power level and never up. Also, going up in power level is just, sometimes it's fun. You know, sometimes it is just fun to pick up a new deck and be like, yeah, this deck feels powerful. You know, I'm doing things that I could never do before.
Either new versions of the card, which will cost more, or you'll need to buy packs in order to get the new card, also generating money for whatever card game you are playing. So power creep is a lucrative way for them to make you have to spend money on newer cards. This way, power creep can feel kind of draining on players, either feeling like all of their old cards basically serve no purpose after new cards come out to replace them, or they feel like their wallet is being stretched by cards coming out that they're forced to buy over and over again over a game's lifespan.
Yeah, this is a great point. I think power creep is in some ways necessary for card games, and in some ways it can even be fun to make more powerful archetypes every once in a while. I think there is a lot. It's a dangerous path to go down, because if you're doing it too fast, or if you're doing it too blatantly, and also in too large of steps, right? Like you can power creep a deck by just making another deck that is slightly more powerful than it, right? But that will it'll leave the people playing the older deck still feeling like they're somewhat competing, right? Like the new deck is just slightly better than what already exists. There's a much bigger difference when something comes out and it's just like so blatantly powerful that like everything before then feels like basically irrelevant immediately. And I think those are the kind of things where you got to be careful with power creep, because those are not very well received typically from like the consumer standpoint.
Now, let's talk a bit about power creep in Magic. So Magic, at the beginning of the game, spells were super duper powerful and were definitely the strongest thing that you could do in the game. There was a lot less powerful creatures. Most of the strong creatures were just good stats for the cost and didn't really have a lot of keywords or anything about them. You would just kind of play them down to do the actual killing of your opponent, whereas the spells would give you the gas and the power and the card draw that you would need to actually finish out the game. So as time has progressed, the spells have been toned down in power a little bit, been brought back to what is a little bit slower in comparison to the old spells of yesteryear. Most spells nowadays do something a little bit more reasonable and have a little bit less value for their costs, whereas creatures have only gained since that time. Most creatures don't have downsides anymore, and the creatures that had no text have oftentimes gained a bunch of text that makes them a little more applicable in multiple scenarios, like Dauntless Bodyguard here gaining a line of text to protect your creatures in the late game rather than just being an early game threat. Now, There is a little strategy that Magic has been pulling recently, as both for the last few sets, where they just put good spell effects on the creatures to make it so that way not only are you getting the good effect from the spell when you play the creature, but you also get the creature to help you finish out the game. Examples like...
This is a very common practice that they've also been doing in other mana-based card games, where it just turns out if you attach the effect of a spell onto a body, it just becomes a way better card. Even if the mana value is now slightly higher.
Uro, which comes down here and has an enter the battlefield effect that also triggers when it attacks, that gives you 3 life, a card, and lets you put a land into play. That's basically just a spell on its own, not to mention its escapability, lets you recur it over and over again, getting more copies of the spell going on. Similar card here with Omnath, Locust Creation. Both these cards got banned for similar reasons. You play them down, they have an enter the battlefield effect that gives you back the value from the card that you played. They're a big body, meaning they can easily kill your opponent.
Okay, both of these are banned. I need to remember this for the next time I visit Card Market, just in case it comes up.
And they have an effect that recurs over the course of the game. Landfall,
but these are good cards, noted.
Multiple times per turn, giving you many effects such as life gain, mana, and damage to your opponent. Not to mention that Omnath is super powerful on the board if you leave it, because you can recur landfall again and again over the course of your turns. There's also a variety of power creep cards that are simply cards that were not tested enough. Examples here like Luris or Nadu are cards that simply didn't get enough play testing to see if they would be truly broken.
Hey, I know Luris. I guessed them last time.
Or they thought they would be fine on a release, and then once you release the card, because Magic is a paper game, you can't really errata the cards or nerf the cards in any way. Luris is an example of a card that got errated, which is super duper rare in Magic and basically never happens because of how broken the companion mechanic ended up being. And Nadu has recently been banned in all the formats it was intended for because they simply didn't test the card enough, meaning that these are more freak accidents and outliers compared to regular power creep that would expect over the course of a card game's lifetime. Also, power creep is true in all card games. You're going to see this in everyone. But
I would be really interested to know how often this happens in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, we don't have the sort of communication to know this, but I would love to know if certain cards were intended to be this powerful, or if that was like more of an accident, right? Sometimes I think there's no way that they overlooked this, right? Like, for example, I don't know, Kashtira Arisard, right? There's no way that they didn't know exactly how good that card was, right? But sometimes I do think there's cards where they didn't really anticipate for those to be that good. And we have no real way of knowing. We can just guess because they don't tell us. Like, they're not like, because from my perspective at least, I don't know if they're afraid of that, of doing that, but I would really appreciate something like, if they do a preemptive ban, they could say something like, hey, we didn't anticipate for this card to be this powerful. As it turns out, that's why we're banning it relatively early, or that's why we're changing its text or something like that. I think that's a practice that would overall be very healthy for a card game. If we just were a little more open about, because everyone knows that. Everyone understands that, like, the people at Konami cannot get in enough testing because you cannot replicate the millions of games that people play once the cards actually release. Like, the possibilities that these cards have, they will always unfold once they release to the public. So I feel like it'd be an understandable thing to say, like, hey, we didn't think this card was going to be that good, so we're changing it or we're banning it. I personally would think that'd be an understandable thing to do.
Push stats are the most obvious indicator of power creep happening in your game, and the most obvious thing that you can see is here on Shieldred, which is a 4/5 for 4 mana in black. Normally, flat black creatures in the olden days with push stats would have to have some sort of downside on them to make up for the fact that they have good stats and they cost low mana. However, Shieldred here has a huge upside of gaining life and dealing your opponent damage over the course of the game, not to mention that the body is huge and can easily kill your opponent in 1 to 2 swings with her ability in combination. So, Shieldred, great example of push power creep over the course of Magic's lifespan. Power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a bit different. Much like Magic, the spells in old Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically, they had a spell for absolutely everything. They were super broken, and the creatures in Yu-Gi-Oh! The best thing you could do in early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was just to summon whatever the biggest 4-star guy was and beat your opponent to death with it. Because the spells were so good, it wasn't worth investing in anything larger. You would just play the biggest guy that you could possibly play for one normal summon and beat your opponent to death with it. Now, over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh!, more and more cards came out, starting here with Cyber Dragon, which were, creatures that you could summon that have a special summoning requirement built into them. So Cyber Dragon allowed you to summon from your hand if your opponent controls a monster and you control no monsters, which isn't such a large effect that it was impossible to do. However, you got a relatively large size body for basically no cost to your normal summon because you could special summon Cyber Dragon. Spells were also made very pushed still over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh! However, they were given archetype-specific requirements. So, for example, Sky Striker Mobilize Engage here. If you look at this card, it requires you to have no monsters in your main monster zones, and it also requires you to have 3 spells in your graveyard to activate both halves of its effect. Meaning that if you use Sky Striker Mobilize Engage, you will have to build your deck around the card, forcing you to play it in specific archetypes. This lets you still play with the powerful spell effects that you want to use, however, you have to also jump through a couple hoops to make it work in your deck. Now, because of the special summoning of monsters like Cyber Dragon and more examples that we see in the future, the only real gate to your deck being the normal summon has been removed from Yu-Gi-Oh! Meaning that you can basically summon as many guys as you want on your turn as long as they only require special summons. So this leads to cards like Dark Arm Dragon or the Dragon Rulers, which are super powerful cards that have somewhat of an archetype limiter, meaning that you have to either play dragons or darks in your deck to actually play them out for free. However, these cards are super powerful boss monsters that summon themselves for completely free, meaning they can slam down as early as turn 1, or whenever you end up drawing them, you can play this massive guy down that has a huge impact on the game, basically whenever you have them. Also, the extra deck is introduced over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, where usually it was just used for fusion monsters in the beginning of the game. Now it has cards like Synchros, XYZs, and it also has Link summons, which are all different summoning mechanics that you can use from your extra deck. So if you have any guys in play, you can either use an archetype specific summon to summon a specific archetype boss monster for your archetype, or you can summon a random generic guy that can have a powerful effect like all these ones here that only require specific monsters, not specific types of monsters or specific attributes of monsters. Just any 2 monsters can combine into these powerful effects.
This is accurate. The main balancing factor, the main limiting in modern Yu-Gi-Oh is 2 things. We've got a whole lot of once per turn restrictions, and we've got a whole lot of locking. Because of Yu-Gi-Oh not having a mana system and Yu-Gi-Oh not having a rotation, you can essentially combine every single Yu-Gi-Oh card with other Yu-Gi-Oh cards, which leads to, and this is, I think that is why the things that are being complained about the most are usually things that are typically, they are lacking one of those 2 things. They're lacking a once per turn, or they're lacking an appropriate lock. That is always, it feels like almost a, it feels almost like a lazy solution to make anything powerful. Is like, yeah, we're just gonna make this card, which is a solid Yu-Gi-Oh card, and we're gonna make it broken by making it generic. Right? It's like if Appaloosa needed wind monsters, it would have been still the same powerful Yu-Gi-Oh card that it was, but it would have just helped certain decks out more than others, probably only ones that weren't even meta to begin with. And so we would have looked at Appaloosa completely differently, because we would have looked at it like, oh, this is just support for like certain wind decks, which there aren't many out there, and they probably deserve the help, right? And yeah, some decks could have still made it, but like it would never have been this omnipresent card that like just messes everyone up, right? And I think just this is where we just need to be careful with modern Yu-Gi-Oh. I think that is just what we've signed up for, essentially. By I mean, when I say we, I mean like the game's designers, right? Like that's what you've signed up for by making the game so like non-rotating and like without mana, which is fine, you know. Like you can still make it a good game, but you need to be careful because the restrictions, the game itself does not have many restrictions, so you got to make sure your cards have proper restrictions. And like if you notice, most of the things that people complain about are actually due to lack of restrictions, right?
All roads in Yu-Gi-Oh! Also lead to banning because Yu-Gi-Oh! Has no set rotation, meaning that if any of the special summoning mechanics or spell mechanics end up treading over the line in a specific archetype, they have no choice but to ban cards out from that archetype, which is why Yu-Gi-Oh! Out of all the card games has had as many tier 1 formats as it has, meaning that one deck is so much stronger than the other decks because archetypes are making it so that way decks are very specific and have very...
I would argue this is not even entirely accurate. I would even say I wish we were using the ban list more than we are at the moment. Because the only way to get rid of something is not to ban it. Because the more prevalent way to get rid of something is to just print something more powerful. That is the easiest way to deal with a quote-unquote problem in a format, is just make something more powerful. And that is why I think that is the core problem. Right, that's the core problem, is that I think we're not utilizing the ban list enough. And I think to some extent I can understand why they're doing that, because I think the logic here is basically, rather than banning your card, because we're afraid we're gonna lose customers if we ban their cards, we're just gonna print something more powerful, which essentially gets rid of the problem. But they won't feel like we betrayed them by banning their card, you know what I mean? And the problem is that you're replacing one problem with another problem, essentially.
Powerful tools, and other decks cannot splash tools that those archetypes have because of the power inherent in those archetypes. Powercreep in Hearthstone, very similar, but it has a few differences from the start of the game because Hearthstone is a bit newer than the other games. So you have cards like Wild Growth and SI7 Agent in the base set that are powerful.
Oh, my love SI7 Agent.
Classes want to do, because classes don't really overlap
This
in
guy's
Hearthstone
toast.
the same way it would in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic or Pokemon, where you can play any cards in your deck that you want. This means they can print specific things for specific classes, giving you that identity built into the class itself. Now, the problem with original Hearthstone was that it wasn't really random enough. It was very consistent, and a lot of games ended up playing the exact same way. So they started in the first expansion to release cards that did a random amount of damage, or some
Mad
random amount of
implosion
damage,
and crackle. Holy shit, those were toxic.
More variance in the type of gameplay, but this feels really bad as the player to experience on the other end if you get hit randomly by an implosion that does 4 instead of 2, losing you the game. So Hearthstone decides to introduce a little bit more of Discover. So Discover being a mechanic that gives you a random selection of cards, however you get to pick from the random selection, meaning that you have a little bit more control over what card you're specifically going to end up getting, which feels a lot better as the player. There are also big, powerful effects that get printed that have a bit of randomness built in, but also have a bit of a deck building requirement.
Who am I? None of your
requires
business.
you to have a bunch of secrets in your deck, giving you an interesting deck building choice. Meaning, how many secrets do you want to put in your deck? Which secrets do you want to play? And how likely are you to draw a Mysterious Challenger before you draw your secrets? Depending on how many secrets you put in, will depend on when you draw the Mysterious Challenger and when it works on this most powerful effect. Overall card quality also increases over the course of Hearthstone's lifespan, which is doubly power-crept in Hearthstone because not only does the power level of the cards in your deck increase, but the random cards that you will get over the course of the game, power levels also goes up, meaning that in general, discovering a random card only gets better along with the cards getting better in the game. The same theming kind of happens over the course of the later years. It's just a little bit changed. So Scarab Keychain is another example of a Discover card that you'll see that still sees play even today. Compared to old Discover cards, it just plays down a guy that gives you a body and gives you a Discover. Portalmancer Skyla is a big spell mage payoff.
Hearthstone is one of the best examples about what I said earlier, because they have introduced rotation to Hearthstone, which might make you think like, oh, they don't have to power creep as much anymore. But yet, whenever I revisit Hearthstone, which I do sometimes, it's been a while since I've played, but like, whenever I do wonder, like, no one is playing the old cards anymore, because they've got like they still have that core set from back in the day that still has like those cards that were all like giga staples at the beginning of Hearthstone, like, I don't know, Ragnaros, Cairn, Bloodhoof, Sylvanas and stuff like that. And they just like, they're not playable anymore. Or like, I mean, they're playable, but like no one does. So it still is, power creep is still a thing. You know, you're still mostly incentivized to play with the new cards.
That swaps low and high cost card spells in your hand, letting you cast a high cost spell for very cheap. Similar to Mysterious Challenger, this has deck building requirements, forcing you to play high and low cost spells to be able to swap them. This is another example of basically how Hearthstone has worked throughout the history. All the decks are specific to classes and specific to different archetypes in their own way. Also, there's been more nerfs happening over the course of Hearthstone's lifespan as it gets further into the future and the game balance gets more out of it.
This is the gigantic advantage of an online game, is that you can actually change cards without too much hassle, right? Like, it's a completely normal practice for them to change meta relevant cards to tone it down, which is, I mean, it's wonderful. I understand why you can't do it in paper super regularly, you know, like just we're gonna change the text on this card, you know, like you can tell by how many people are already like annoyed by and how complicated it is going to be with just Primite Ether Barrel, right? Like it's just in paper, it's not as simple to just change a card because it's too powerful. But you know, and you're not gonna run an entirely new print run because you want a certain effect of a card now to be once per turn or something like that. Of course, for the health of the game, it'd be great, but like the logistics behind that for paper card games is just, it's a nightmare.
Of whack. It's a lot harder to balance your game the more cards you add into it, and the more different random elements you add into it makes it harder to predict what cards will be too powerful. So more nerfs happening over the course of the game's lifespan makes a lot of sense as the game has grown in power over time. Power creep in Pokemon is a lot different, if you ask me. You do still...
I haven't played Pokemon much, the trading card game. I've played it before, but I do know that like the Pokemon, don't they have like infinite HP now, and like the early ones just look completely ass, even though once again they have rotation, but like the old ones are so bad in comparison.
Have the same thing as we had in Magic and in Yu-Gi-Oh, where the guys at the beginning, this is the strongest guy we had, Hitmonchan. He's just 70 HP, has a basic attack,
He's an OG. I had him in school. The Hitmonchan card, I had it.
Pretty expensive retreat cost. But the spells, or trainers as they're called, Pokemon, are super powerful. Computer search, super good. You can discard 2 cards and then get any card you possibly could want in your entire deck.
It's funny how that's a theme with most card games they've just shown, like Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Pokemon, where the monsters or creatures or Pokemon itself were all super weak and basic, but the spell cards slash trainers slash whatever were all giga powerful because they just have like no concept of what's a powerful spell card and so on and so forth.
Put in your hand, obviously super strong. Now, over the years, they have kind of flipped the script on this, whereas the Pokemon have gotten a lot stronger, they've gotten abilities, they've gotten more damage, they've gotten more HP.
Look at this.
In Pokemon,
120 HP, ability, better attacks, and this is probably still a bad card, right? This Hitmonchan does not look very good. If this Pokemon is damaged, and even if it's knocked out, put 3 damage. Yeah, no, this card's not. No way.
That go up are the numbers on the Pokemon, so you can see that having an extra 50 health, but basically the exact same cost on the new Hitmonchan card compared to the old one. It's interesting what they did with the items, though. A lot of the powerful items, like Computer Search here, became ace spec cards, which means you can only play one.
Oh yeah, when I played, there was ace spec cards. It was like 2014 or something.
Of it in your deck, and that's of any ace spec card, not specifically just Computer Search, meaning that you still get to play with the super powerful card from the olden days, but you only get one copy, meaning that you only have one time where you can actually use it for its powerful effect. An interesting way of balancing.
They're back now in standard. Oh, that's cool.
Old, and also other trainer cards came out that are obviously more reasonably powered compared to Computer Search. Now, EX Pokemon, another way that they bumped.
This dude was also around when I played the Mewtwo mirrors with X-Ball. Oh,
the power level of Pokemon. We have Mewtwo EX and Charizard EX. These are 2 different EX Pokemon from 2 very different eras. However,
330.
they both have the same requirement where when they are knocked out, your opponent gets to take 2 prize cards. However, as a cost for this, they both deal extra damage compared to normal and also have a much higher HP stat than normal, meaning they can usually take multiple hits, or if they can't take multiple hits, they can knock out multiple Pokemon over the course of the game because of their powerful attacks. This kind of changes the pace and the rules around how fast Pokemon is supposed to go, because in general, it was really hard to take more than 1 KO per turn in the older Pokemon days. However, with the introduction of EX Pokemon, and
I think this is a similar development that Yu-Gi-Oh has gone through, where like I think they just deemed the OG style of playing the game a little bit too slow and grindy, which something that OG players will always value about something like, in Yu-Gi-Oh terms, like GOAT format or Edison format, is something like, you know, they just feel like it's more exciting, you know, give him the opportunity to take 2 prizes with 1 KO. Why not? Give him the opportunity. There's also, I think there's some that give you 3. like the tag teams, I think gave you 3 prizes, as opposed to the super grindy and slow knock out 6 Pokemon until you win kind of thing, right?
Other Pokemon that will force your opponent to take additional prize cards when they're knocked out, it means that the game kind of speeds up and the focus changes from being about specifically getting 6 prize cards to be getting 6 prize cards in any combination of destroying your opponent's EX Pokemon or knocking out bench Pokemon. Or
I noticed I got skipped in Deck Doctor. Does that mean you just don't have enough knowledge on my deck? It depends what deck you're using, but I did include most. I just didn't keep the original sorting. We're not done yet. We're going to continue. I'm not sure if we can get through everything. But no, I haven't. The Millennium, no, the Millennium is it's going to be in there. But yeah,
sniping down powerful basic Pokemon. Also, it changes a little bit where, because of the fact that you are focused on getting specific things, a lot more engines are popping up. Claydol is the one I'm most familiar with, which lets you draw 6 cards from your deck by putting 2 cards from your hand on the bottom if you want. Or you have the new card Pit.ex, which lets you search your deck for any card if you have it in play once per turn. So these 2 engines kind of let you go over the course of the game and draw multiple cards or get specific cards that you need. And this is a little bit more important in Pokemon because you need to knock out your opponent's Pokemon over the course of many turns, as opposed to all just one big turn where you get all of your prize cards at the same time. Also, it is rare, but there are disruption cards that have been taking place over the course of Pokemon that have power crept other things that have...
They have a ban list in Pokemon?
Generally needed to be banned because of their power level. Cards like Vileplume or Seismitoad EX come down and they disrupt your opponent's abilities to play items, meaning that if you get these guys down early enough, your opponent will literally not be able to do any setting up with any of their item cards, being able to build a board, and you will simply overwhelm them with literally anything because your opponent will simply not be able to do anything with Quaking Punch hitting you or with the Irritating Ball and stopping you from playing any items. In conclusion, I want to talk about one final thing with Pokemon here. So they had a rules overhaul and an early rotation in a very important moment in Pokemon when Sableye and Crobat G were kind of dominating the metagame. So
if Sableye is your active Pokemon, you go first. Wait, you can guaranteed going first? That's a good idea, yeah.
Sableye has Overeager, which basically makes you go first every time if you have Sableye down.
What happens if both players have Sableye?
And Crobat has Flashbite, which allows you to put 1 damage on your opponent's Pokemon, which doesn't sound super powerful, but these 2 cards combined led to a lot of early game turn 1 wins from you being able to knock out your opponent's only remaining Pokemon.
Oh, if both players have it, this does nothing. Okay, never mind.
The very first turn of the game, and because you went first, your opponent couldn't do anything to stop that from happening. So Pokemon completely reworked the game and made it completely different, so that way they could preserve the intent of the game to be going over the course of multiple turns. So they stopped you from being able to attack on the first turn.
Wait, so this was an FTK deck? You guaranteed go first because of the Sableye, and then you just Crobat your opponent's Pokemon over and over?
They stopped you from being able to play supporters on the first turn. They stopped you from being able to evolve on the first turn. There are many things they stopped you from being able to do on the first turn of the game, so that way the games would last a minimum amount of turns in comparison to just ending as soon as physically possible. Speed and power have to be kept in check in card games, and I think this overhaul that Pokemon did is a really great example of why you need to keep it in check. If the game gets too fast, oftentimes you'll need to make large, massive changes to what happens to cards and gameplay in general to keep the game balanced. And this is what is super important about keeping in mind when you're seeing power creep happen. As long as your core game remains the same, power creep is okay. Once it pushes over that edge of speed and power, you gotta rein it back. Formats also help to diversify the needs of different card game audiences, because when you have a card game over many years, many players are going to have different things that they want from your card game. For example, if you have a really slow format and then you make your game faster because that's what you want for the modern player base, other players may want to go back to that old format. This is something we're seeing a lot in Yu-Gi-Oh now, with old formats from previous sets being played by people who want a slower form of Yu-Gi-Oh, and the people who want the faster version of Yu-Gi-Oh can play the modern format that is being played right now in Yu-Gi-Oh.
Yeah, I think that's a good conclusion. Is like power creep is natural and is part of, I mean, every card game, right? Like all of these card games have it, despite having rotation, some of them using ban lists, some of them having rotations more frequently, stuff like that. There's still moments in their times where they gotta like rework the rules and slow down power creep and stuff like that. Like it does exist, but for Yu-Gi-Oh specifically, of course, the complete absence of a rotation does amplify the issues with power creep, I would say. And also, I think what is also a very deciding factor is the hesitant use of the ban list. I think, like, I personally feel like the ban list is, of course, from their perspective, a marketing tool as well to make sure we get the new cards. But from my perspective as a player and a consumer of the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game, it should also be used more aggressively as a balancing tool, just to make the game healthier. And I think it can be both. But I do think it just tends to be just slightly late in terms of making certain changes. I don't think it's outrageous. Like, for example, we always assume like a deck comes out and it's incredibly powerful, and then we assume like, oh, that's just gonna be around for 6 months or something before anything happens, or maybe even 9 months. And I'm wondering why that is. You know, why if something is so much more powerful than everything else, why can't it be toned down a little bit after 3 months? Because it's still gonna be good after 3 months if they make a slight change to it. Interesting video. I liked it.